you see me come and make some room.
Everywhere I go, I'm in the spotlight. This is a good life. I'm living bold. This is what it looks like on the ticket of the world.
So last week, we briefly talked about Congressman Dusty Johnson of South Dakota announcing that he was going to be introducing OSRA 2.0. He said he was going to do it this week. Well, he did, and the text is out. And there was even a second hearing of the T&I, the Transportation and Infrastructure House Committee hearing, talking to the World Shipping Council, Cotton Shippers Association, Port of Long Beach, Ports America. We're going to get into all of it. And to help me break it down today, we are welcoming a special guest, Dr. Sal Mercogliano. So stick around. It's going to be a great conversation today. Hi, welcome to By Land and By Sea, an attorney breaking down the week in supply chain, presented by the Maritime Professor, me. I'm Lauren Beagen, founder of the Maritime Professor and Squall Strategies, and I'm your favorite maritime attorney. Join me every week as we walk through both ocean transport and surface transport topics in the wild world of supply chain. As always, the guidance here is general and for educational purposes only. It should not be construed to be legal advice, and there is no attorney-client privilege created by this video. If you need an attorney, contact an attorney. But before we get into the discussion of the day, let's go through my top 3 stories of the week. All right, story number 1, right off the bat, OSRA 2.0 has been introduced, right? So last week I mentioned that Congressman Dusty Johnson of South Dakota was planning on releasing OSRA 2.0. He did it. And I also thought that he would be introducing language relating to the FMC's ability, or should I say inability, to deny the alliance agreements that are filed with the FMC. Look, we've talked about this before. The FMC does not have the ability to deny the agreements that are filed with them, specifically talking about the alliance vessel sharing agreements. The FMC doesn't actually even approve them. They're just automatically going into effect after 45 days, which, okay, that 45-day period can be told with questions if the FMC does have more questions to the filers of the agreement about the content of the agreement or questions that they might have. But really, in order for the FMC to stop these alliance agreements or these vessel sharing agreements, they have to file an injunction in district court. They have to file a lawsuit in an outside court, not within the FMC, obviously. And if you haven't heard, the FMC is quite busy these days, right? They have less than 200 employees, and actually it's closer to like 130, 150 employees. And they are trying to hire quite quickly, but they also have a bunch of rulemakings going on. So all of that to say, in order to have them file an injunction to block an agreement that they would determine to be either anti-competitive or contrary to the Shipping Act or just too high of a market share is a pretty big hurdle for an otherwise pretty busy agency. Commissioner Carl Bensel and Commissioner Max Vekich actually sent a letter to Congress last December requesting this denial authority. But look, we didn't see it end up in the OSRA 2.0 bill. We're going to talk about that. I want to hear Dr. Mercogliano's thoughts on this in a little bit, but we're going to be coming back to OSRA 2.0 and what's going on with the FMC's ability to deny these alliance agreements. All right, story number 2. Let's get right into it. Moving along. Another interesting bill released last week was the Ocean Shipping Antitrust Enforcement Act. I didn't really talk about it last week, but essentially this bill, which is really only a few pages long for how impactful it would be, intends to repeal certain exemptions from antitrust laws that the FMC was otherwise in charge of. So essentially, these alliances that we're talking about are able to form these vessel sharing agreements, these alliance agreements that may otherwise be, monopolistic, right? But they're allowed to do it because they file the agreements with the FMC, and then the FMC reviews those agreements and also monitors the agreements after enactment. So this bill seeks to do away with that antitrust monopoly protection. So look, I don't think this is the way to go. I think that alliances serve a very important and beneficial role for the shipping industry generally. And really one of the most notable benefits that I've often pointed out is routing. I've mentioned this before, but I always kind of equate it to airlines because I think that that's something we can all understand. If you want to go from Boston to Denver, you could either go with Delta, who's in one of these airline alliances, or you can go with Southwest, who notably isn't. If you go with Southwest, you're probably going to have to stop over in Kansas City on the way. You have no reason to go there, but that's the route they offer. Whereas Delta, You book your ticket, you may actually be flying on Eagle Air, but you don't really care. You don't really know. They're doing business as Delta, and you're going to go direct Boston to Denver without that extra stop in Kansas City. It's kind of the same idea with these ocean alliances. So instead of a few vessels traveling the same route with half full ships, what they are allowed to do under these agreements is they pool their vessels and they pool some of their equipment. I mean, really the vessels here, and are now able to use really one vessel for that same route that is mostly or entirely full. And then the other vessels that otherwise were doing that same trip are now available for smaller ports or different routes or something that maybe the customers have been asking for. So we're going to be talking to Dr. Mercogliano about this a little bit too. How does he feel about this repeal of this antitrust enforcement? So last story of the day, and I always like to highlight articles that I think are interesting or cover topics well. I want to draw your attention to an article out of Bloomberg this week by Laura Curtis. She does a really great job of kind of summarizing the legislative proposals and hearings that we saw both last week and this week on the Hill, most of which we're going to be chatting about shortly today. But in the article, she says there's a larger conversation unfolding about whether keeping antitrust immunity for ocean carriers with increased oversight by the Federal Maritime Commission or do away with the exemption entirely, which would eliminate the FMC's oversight of the competitive impact of carrier and marine terminal agreements. Great question, great tee up. Let's get into the meat and potatoes of the day. So I asked a few months ago if you, the listeners, wanted me to start incorporating guests onto the show, and resoundingly the answer was yes. So I want to make sure that my guests were targeted and really synced up with the overall theme of what by land and by sea really is, right? We provide clear explanations of the industry in a way that everybody can understand, not just those who only speak industry lingo or legal terms. And so I thought, who better to kick off my kind of periodic guest slot than none other than Dr. Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to the show, By Land and by Sea. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me, Professor Beagen. I appreciate the opportunity and the invite. I would ask guests on my show on a more regular basis, but I'm afraid that my viewers would like the guests more than me, and I don't want to take that chance.
Well, you did have me on your show one time before, so this is kind of full circle, right? So, and Professor Mercogliano, Dr. Mercogliano,
or Sal. Sal's fine.
Sal, you can call me Lauren. Well, thanks for being the first guest on this show. I'm so excited to have you here. So undoubtedly to the listeners, you've probably heard of Dr. Mercogliano, Sal. He hosts a wildly successful YouTube show. Honestly, wildly successful. What's going on with shipping? He's a maritime professor himself, and more than just maritime too. You're the chair of the Department of History, Criminal Justice and Politics at Campbell University in North Carolina. Beautiful locale, by the way. Maritime historian, former merchant mariner, so you actually did go to sea, and best of all, incredibly knowledgeable on, and I'm going to say all things maritime. I've been specifically super impressed with your understanding of the FMC, mostly because, as you know, it can be very nuanced and detailed, but you follow it so well. So I'm so excited to have you here today.
Well, I'm excited to be here, and let's be clear, for you and I both, it's Nerd Out Week on FMC News. I mean, beyond the congressional testimonies, as you mentioned, legislation coming out, and this is. I mean, I don't think people really appreciate that this is the first time in 20-something years that you're seeing a string of legislation that's dealing with international shipping. We had OSRA last year, and now we're having ads onto it. So this is a good moment for us.
It is. Yeah, there really is a lot going on. So just for a little bit of background, we've talked about it before, but the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 1998 was actually the first OSRA that came about. So this is the Shipping Act of 1984 is kind of the original text, which actually there was a Shipping Act of 1916, is that right?
There was a Shipping Act of 1916. You got the Shipping Act of 84. You got the Ocean Shipping Reform of 96. I mean, there's been a lot of. There's been but that's. I mean, you see that's spate. Then you get the Merchant Marine Acts, and it's about 10, 20 years where you see these kind of adjustments and changes, and that's what we're seeing right now. We're at one of those inflection points.
Exactly, and so the OSRA of 98 was actually a deregulation, right? So prior to 98, we had conferences, which were kind of member-based clubs that were, I mean, not the equivalent of alliances, but kind of similar idea. But they were clubs, they were kind of dues, I think, were associated with them. But then in 98, because of the deregulation, you saw really kind of like the sunsetting of these conferences. And then after 98, we went through quite a few years of vessel sharing kind of piecemeal that was happening. And then after that, it really started to come back together in the early 2010s when these ocean carriers were losing money in a year. I mean, it was honestly, right. I mean, that's something that people don't really understand or remember, really, especially kind of newcomers to paying attention to ocean shipping, is that nobody was more surprised than the ocean carriers at making billions of dollars. They didn't think they were going to make billions, I'm sure of it. But because in the 2010s, 2015s, they were operating at a loss over the years. So
the statistic that gets me every time is the concept that in 2021, the ocean shipping, the carriers, everything from Maersk down to Yangmin, the big ones, they made more profits in a single year than they did in a decade combined. And you're right. It's an area where we have not spent a lot of attention to. There's been a lot of changes that have been going on to it, but deregulation was the mark. That was the key thing, was really kind of deregulating and open up the ocean shipping, because again, that period also marks the end of the Cold War. There's no longer going to be seen to be a high seas confrontation, and the idea was the oceans are open, and we're going to use them as these highways of commerce, as the way it was originally envisioned.
Exactly. So then we kind of move forward, right? So we had these alliances as a new thing in 2014. I think 2M, I think, was filed in 2014, 2015, right? So now we saw 2M, the decoupling of 2M. So now we have OSRA 2.0. We had OSRA, Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2022, made a lot of reform around detention and demurrage, the 13 invoice items that we saw. But really, I mean, it was for an industry, or for a congressional movement of trying to get at the ocean carriers. It didn't really totally do that. I thought, it got at some of the detention and demurrage, and it tried to clean up generally. But I felt like there were still conversations to be had. So I'm not too surprised to see an OSRA 2.0. Initially, I think the OSRA 2.0 was supposed to be more technical corrections, but then there was more content based to it. And so what we're seeing is, as it's now called, the Ocean Shipping Reform Implementation Act instead of technical corrections, right?
Name than that, but still is not the best name. And I think you're right. I think when you look at what they're trying to do, it's the progression, where we're seeing that progression in the evolution of the legislature coming out. And again, I think Garamendi and Johnson are trying to build on the initiative that they had before. Now, I think that could be a problem too, because I think there's a misconception in some areas that you kind of mentioned in your lead up to this, that, there's probably some areas that definitely need more reform. There are areas I don't think you would want to touch, because it would be a third rail. And I'm sure we're going to talk about that a little bit.
That's right. Well, and so we had an appetite in 2022, right? So COVID happened. We had congestion already leading up to 2022. So saying that it was entirely COVID isn't totally accurate, because 2015, as you've mentioned on your show before, and I've mentioned here, we had congestion report out of the Federal Maritime Commission that really almost is kind of like the precursor playbook. I mean, it's like the crystal ball of what's to come. The equipment shortages, warehouse space, limitations, congestion at ports. So the FMC kind of saw this coming, obviously not with the spike in demand, and that's really kind of what set it all off. But Commissioner Dye had been following this for a while, and we've both talked about before. We love Commissioner Dye. She's the best, right?
My unabashed love for Rebecca Dye is announced. It's been announced many times. I think she is, without a doubt, one of those just bedrocks that the FMC is built on. But that report, you said, when I, again, me scrolling through the FMC website one day, because who doesn't do that on just for fun, and you read that report right in the middle of COVID, it's like, holy cow! Spot on so many areas. But again, what industries were really geared up to take a plus, or a plus, 5+, 5- hit and be able to compensate for that? There are very few industries out there that can do that. They make small adjustments here and there. They have growth programmed into it, but the hit that came in 2020 was a global hit. And we've seen the shipping industry handle regional hits. We've seen them handle natural disasters and local phenomenon. But you got to go back to 2008 when the economy really bottomed out to see a recent one. But there were so many different factors at play in 2020 versus 2008. You had have the new ships coming online. You got the new Panama Canal lane. You had all these elements that did not exist before, where, again, I say it all the time, we never had a shortage of ships. I mean, there were 109 off LA. There was no shortage of ships. The issue was that whole transportation system being able to handle it in the levels that was there. And that's what got the attention of Congress, which is always a good or a bad thing at times.
Yeah. Well, it made it into the State of the Union, right? For the first time ever, I think ocean shipping was there.
It did. Ocean shipping was in there. It was great. It was that great moment. It was a line, but heck, I'll take a line. It's great. It was great to see it mentioned at all.
Yeah, I mean, no press is bad press, right? That's what they say. So no, but I mean, it was such an interesting time too, because it wasn't like everybody was ordering. I mean, there was a run on toilet paper, which is lightweight, smaller bulk sizing commodity, but there was a run on furniture. There was a run on large things. I mean, people were doing house projects of large lumber orders. So it was heavy and it was bulky. And so not only was it a run on demand for these, as we know, 90% of everything moves by ocean shipping that comes into this country, 80% across the globe. And so 90% of everything that we eat, consume, touch, breathe, everything is moving by ocean shipping. And so then to have demand, but then demand of large items only compounded the problem, really. So you didn't really have the diversification of entry that you kind of see now. We're seeing more medium ships move into some of these smaller ports just to try to control the import piece of it, so that you're not waiting or stuck in congestion under another worst case scenario. And I think that's why we're seeing the West Coast ports still kind of stay tampered down in their imports and their numbers. And we're seeing the East Coast ports kind of move up a little bit just because of that diversification of control of the ports of entry, right?
And that was happening before COVID. We saw that shift taking place for a variety of reasons. You open the new lane in the Panama Canal, you start building these neo-Panamax vessels that can swing a variety of routes. And, it was really interesting. If you look at those vessels that were off LA and Long Beach, they were an interesting cavalcade of different vessels. A lot of them had been pulled off ocean routes in Asia and Africa and the Middle East, vessels you would never see going trans-Pacific. And you move them over. I had a very interesting discussion on LinkedIn a couple of days ago where I was talking about the new alliances that came in. It's like, alliances has been around for a long time. It's like, no, the new alliances are different than what existed in the past. So I think we need to come up with different names for them, because what we have now is, as you mentioned and said so well, is a lot different than what exists today. But we also changed the type of ships coming in. We had a lot of ships that would never come in, too small and everything. But now you see this huge building going on. They're right-sizing the fleet. We've got a whole issue going on with technology of propulsion and fuel, which is another subset that's requiring everybody to ditch their old ships, because now you're graded on your performance. You've got a slow steam, and we've got so many factors that are playing in right now. Add to it, LA, Long Beach talking about green corridors and all the legislation that California is doing. And it just makes everything so dynamic. And again, I think lawmakers saw an opportunity here. Is like, okay, this is unregulated. This is the wild, wild west. And because of the diffuse nature of shipping, even ports, LA and Long Beach are municipal ports. They're controlled by a council that's voted in. It's not even the state of California. It's just, it's the city of Long Beach and Los Angeles that are running the ports. And so I thought there's got to be an attempt to get control. And as we talked about the other day, when you can get a congressman from South Dakota, which is a heavy ag state, to sit there and propose a shipping legislation bill, that shows you the impact that the supply chain in ocean shipping is having.
Exactly. And it's so funny. You kind of see, okay, sponsored by Dusty Johnson and co-sponsored by John Garamendi, who's out of California, but you see South Dakota and you're like, South Dakota, but exactly like you said, right? So that's ag country, agricultural products. And so the agricultural products, we've seen a lot of lobbying for the export side, right? As much as we're bringing in 90% of everything. We also, want to sell stuff, right? As the U.S. Kind of just consumer base, we want to be selling our products as well. And so there's been this real fight, I guess fight is the right word, to try to kind of claw back and get more opportunity for exports to be going out, because that's something that we were seeing, and that's one of the rulemakings that the FMC is covering, the unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate. It was kind of swayed and intended for exports, although it is kind of neutral, right? It's for imports as well. But what was happening was we were seeing these carriers just popping up out of nowhere, grabbing onto these $20,000 freight rates going from China to the U.S., and then not waiting or saying, no, we don't take exports or whatever it is. I mean, it's safety at some point, right? They have to take some containers out. Otherwise, they're going to be off balance. But that's what we were seeing, is that they were just profiteering off of these pop-up, carrier lines, profiteering off the 20,000, but then not waiting to take some of the exports that otherwise would have gone. And so you're seeing an imbalance of the equipment. If you're not taking the container boxes back over to China to get filled up, you're not going to have any boxes, right? And we saw that happening at some point as well.
Right. I mean, you saw empties piling up in the containers. You saw a huge shift. I mean, we were talking about 2 to 1 or 3 to 1, empties to export containers going out. And it got to 4 to 3 to 1. And the container companies argued a lot about this. The rate is so low, it's not profitable for us to take it. But in truth, what we knew was they wanted the empty boxes back in East Asia so they can load them and spin them around faster, because we saw box production go up. And again, most box production is in China. The lessees for the boxes are in China, so you got to return them there. And there was a big shift. Add to it, you had the Russia-Ukraine war, where grain all of a sudden on the world market was spiking in price. Canada didn't get mentioned here, but the Fraser River flooding happened, shut Vancouver off from central Canada, so you had all the Canadian grain couldn't get out, and you had American ag was just screaming, we got to get out and get our commodities out. And again, it got a lot of attention. I think Dusty Johnson was the co-sponsor, but he had a lot of support coming in. You look at who signed that bill and who was for it. I mean, it was a Midwest bill that had a lot of oomph behind it, that they were going to sit there. And again, I go back to this issue that I think the ocean shippers did themselves a huge disservice at this point. The World Shipping Council did a great job in talking about how they kept the world supplied. I thought they did, again, we would not be where we are today without the consortium, the shipping companies out there shipping for so low. But I think they did themselves a huge disservice by not being attuned to what was happening on the West Coast, and particularly with ocean shipping and the need of the agricultural exporters. At the same time, they were making huge profits on the imports. They love the imports, but exports was the backside that was not paying enough for them. And so I think they just didn't give it enough attention.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, it's such a tough area, right? Because at the time, nobody really knew if their industry was going to survive. And I think that was also true, right? We weren't sure if this was going to be a boom for a minute or a boom for a while. And so, obviously there were some bad decisions made, right, across the board. And certainly we saw the FMC is kind of going through and cleaning up what maybe some of the bad decisions were during that time on overcharging for detention and demurrage or whatever it was on the imports. But I think that's a really interesting point, because I think that the carriers, you've said it in a couple different venues that they could have messaged it differently, because it is providing such a service. There's only so many of them, right? There's only 9-10 carriers out there, major carriers.
And I think they have Hanjin on the mind lots of times. There's a lot of issues that they're always thinking about. Okay, what can go wrong here? and they are. And again, they're a unique group because some of them are shareholder based, some are family based. Mm-hmm. And it's a weird group. It's shipping. It's always shipping. Mm-hmm. It's always weird. And so who are they answering to? Mm-hmm. And they adopt different strategies. If you look at MSC and Maersk today, man, you want to talk about two big companies in an alliance, but two diametrically opposed strategies in what they want to be. MSC wants to be a shipping firm. Maersk wants to be logistics. They want to be Amazon. They want to do everything. And you bring them together. And again, my big issue now is they're flush with cash. And, a sailor drunk on money is never a good thing. We don't know how they're going to handle it. And that's the big question we're seeing right now. And now you have Congress coming in with a variety of bills, which I think is really interesting. This is not one huge omnibus bill. They're breaking them up into small little pieces so that they can do it. Because again, we know the Senate's going to be the big problem for getting any legislation through. That's going to be the hurdle they have to get over. So a lot of OSRA 2.0, things that Garamendi and Johnson saw get kicked out of the original bill that they want to put back in.
Right. And just for clarification, so Hanjin was a ocean carrier that did go bankrupt. So like we said, in the 2015 time period, we saw a lot of these carriers who were losing money as their overall kind of annual profit and loss statement. And not everybody could float that for more than a few years. And unfortunately, Hanjin, the too big to fail, right? The whole idea of too big to fail. Unfortunately, Hanjin did go bankrupt. And so it took quite a few years to get the empties out of service. They were just still floating around with being abandoned, different ports and different locations, trying to, to have a 40-foot TEU abandoned and multiple. I mean, that was a big problem for terminals around the country and around the world as well. But so 2014, we saw these alliance, kind of these vessel sharing turn from piecemeal vessel sharing, spot rates or slot charters into kind of these more formal alliance formations. But you're right. I mean, they were done in a way that was also reviewed at the time. We've seen the FMC come out and say, look, they are competing with each other, because what's clear and what's not as clear to regular society, and certainly maybe new congressmen that are now kind of paying attention, is that there's three major alliances out there, and they are competing with each other. It's not one that makes up 80%, it's three that make up 20 to 30%. And actually, I think JOC ran a piece saying that it's actually probably even less market share than that, based on the vessels that they actually dedicate to these vessel sharing agreements versus just the company generally as a kind of entering party into this agreement.
If you look at Maersk and MSC, for example, I mean, they represent 35% of the share, but it's not 35% in 2M. That's where you get into that fine difference that you're talking about.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, and the other thing is too, so when these alliances were kind of being reviewed in the 2014, 2015, there was another one out there that was pitched, P3, that didn't get passed, right? So it wasn't the FMC that blocked it. I believe it was China that blocked it, Ministry of Transport. But that's also these were really kind of reviewed, and that's something that we talked about the other day on the roundtable, is that if one major regulatory agency denies it, whether the FMC is allowed to deny it or not, if one major regulatory agency finds a way to block it, it's not going to probably go forward in the other rest of the world market. And so you have the European Commission Director General for Competition, who's kind of the European Union equivalent, so to speak, on these alliances. You have the FMC, and then you have China with the Ministry of Transport. P3 was blocked at that time. So it's not to say it was a free-for-all and all alliances went forward.
No, and I think the point you made was actually the teams.
It looks like we might be having a little bit of technical difficulties here. You're a little choppy. Oh, you're a little choppy. As you were starting that point, it got a little choppy. No problem.
So you were exactly right with this idea. And if we sit here and decide, okay, we're going to get rid of the alliance system, but that has global implications. An alliance system, the example I had is I talked to a friend of mine in Australia, and she sat there and told me, he's like, if you break up the alliance system, understand that we're not going to get service on as many ports in Australia. What will wind up probably happening is one company may come into one port, and then we're going to have to deal with the local transportation of that, which is going to have ramifications. If that's Australia, magnify that around the world. And now all of a sudden, you, with your analogy that you did earlier between Southwest and Delta, becomes the case for global shipping, which is going to see increased costs. And we're going to see increased costs in shipping anyway. I know everyone's looking at falling freight rates right now, but again, because of the fuel issue, because of the new builds, and once everything gets scrapped and things begin to settle down, we're going to see freight rates come back up again. There's no doubt in my mind. We just have a lot of capacity out there right now, but the companies are right sizing. They're getting rid of a lot of old ships. And now all of a sudden we're going to see that adjustment. And the question is, what does this legislation do down the road? We got to be careful of the knee-jerk reaction, reacting to 2021, 22, and think about what's best for the long term. And that's why I think the important piece of legislation that's really being passed here is that plus up for the FMC. I think that is huge. I think that is an agency that needs it. I was really struck when Garamendi in one of the hearings, the T&I hearings, asked, the chairman of the FMC, Dan Maffei, how would you feel if you had the same authority as other commissions? The SEC, the FCC. What happens if you had that? And I think that's what he's aiming for. I think that's what he's aiming for, is to give them the resources and the enforcement abilities to do more, especially with the new detention and demurrage issues that are coming out, which you saw in the other hearing that Ports America did not like at all.
Well, and I think that's interesting too. So when Garamendi brought up that you don't have the same enforcement mechanisms as other agencies, I think you're right. I think he meant in terms of kind of like financial ability, but they do have enforcement mechanisms, right? They have a whole Bureau of Enforcement that's now an Office of Enforcement under the Bureau of Enforcement Investigations and Compliance, newly restructured. And they are able to assess civil penalties. And we've seen them assess $1 million civil penalties before for bad acting, as they say, or violations to the Shipping Act. And that's one of the methods of kind of, you can report a violation of the Shipping Act to the FMC. It might not help you directly, but it does kind of like you can report bad acting to the FMC. And that's where that enforcement office can either enforce adjudications and lawsuits that have already happened at the FMC, or go after, quote unquote, bad guys that they agree with, or maybe not agree with. If they don't agree with you, they're not going to go after them, right? So having this Office of Enforcement, but I completely agree that they need more funding, right? I mean, so they're asking for $43 million, but $43 million, I mean, that's such a small line item, right? Like, I think MARAD gives out more in a grant to like ports than $43 million to the FMC as an entire agency regulating 90% of the world's ocean shipping.
Right. And I think, when you look at what their budget was, 30 million or something like that, and what they're asking for, it's not huge. I mean, it's a big plus up for them. And again, it's the resources. It's the resources they need. Because again, if you look, I was really taken back by the statistic on how many people are filing issues right now and the amount of claimants coming in. And so there's more. And I think that's also an important element too. We got to be thinking about too is what's going to stop people from making claims against shipping companies? Well, if there's only 3 of them out there versus the 10 that are out there now in large ways, that's going to be a problem, because if you anger MSC and MSC is the only person in town, what are you going to do to fix that down the road? And and at the same time too, we got to be careful, because what we've seen over the past 30 years is consolidation. Whereas before we had top 30 companies handled 50%, now it's the top 10 companies handle 80%. So we're seeing consolidation. So there's 2 sides to that issue when it's voiced. But I do agree with you. I think the data issue is so important, and the ability to synthesize that data, to take the claimants and to adjudicate them. Because I think one of the things that gets lost is a lot of companies are not going to file suit because they're going to lose money on the suit. It's going to take them too long to do it. They would rather not do it because of the turnaround involved.
Well, and I think that's exactly great point too, that there's only so many carriers out there. And so, you even though something may have happened in the past that you're like, this was wrong, and the shipper may feel that this might be something worth filing a lawsuit about, they also, don't want to bite the hand that feeds them a little bit, right? So they still want to be able to move their goods in the future to continue as a business. So that's always been kind of the push and pull. And I feel like the past few years through the FMC, getting a little bit more authority, getting a little bit more attention, and getting a little bit more, I guess, credibility. I mean, they've always been a very credible agency, but now they have a little bit more attention, and people are seeing what they do, and that they're lean, that they're, like a lean, mean fighting machine kind of. I think shippers are feeling a little bit more comfortable to explore these options, whether it is filing a lawsuit or actually just some of the other methods that they have, right? They have alternative dispute resolution, they have mediation. There's other ways of still kind of figuring out and solving these problems. And so to get back into the pending legislation, right? So we have the Ocean Shipping Antitrust Enforcement Act. And so it really is to repeal certain exemptions from antitrust laws. To be clear, it's to repeal the monopoly, the otherwise acceptable monopoly, because the FMC is watching them, of these vessel sharing alliance agreements. It's backed by a lot of people, right? I mean, we have Jim Costa, we have John Garamendi, Josh Harder, Jimmy Panetta, and then South Coast Dusty Johnson. Most all of them are from California, except for Dusty, like we're saying. To me, it doesn't feel like the right way to go. How do you feel about it? I mean, we've kind of been talking about it, but
yeah, I think raising the issue, it's a big issue. I mean, because it's so easy to sit there and point the blame. It's like, oh, these big shipping companies, look at the profits they're making. And again, I go back to the World Shipping Council not doing a great job and really being that vocal advocate for them to talk about this shipping entity that what it has done. And I do think that, repealing the conference system, the alliance system, again, I don't think it's a trust. And again, that's the thing, if you start talking about trust busting, it's a whole different thing. This is a vessel sharing agreement. I think it needs to be clarified, but I don't think it's understood by many. I think shipping is understood by many anyway. We know that or else we wouldn't have an audience. But this is what we try tried to explain. But I do think what's interesting about it in many ways is it gives the shipping companies some pause. I think they're more willing to negotiate and talk to the FMC. I think it gives the FMC commissioners a lot of power. It's like, because now the shipping companies may have blown off the FMC in the past because they're small. We don't have to worry about them too much. Not now. They want to have the FMC on their side. And I think that's a powerful element that's going in. And again, I'm not even sure how much relevant it's going to be, because when Maersk and MSC break apart, they're breaking apart because they're too big for each other. And they're going to represent 15% slices of ocean shipping. And, I heard, MSC talked about this. Is like, the fear is you break up the alliances, and what you're going to have to do next is have companies fold into other companies. And whether that happens naturally, I think it will over time. You may accelerate it if you do this. But again, I think it's the global. I think we're going to hear it from the European Union and our allies a lot more than anybody else. I think they're going to be the ones who are going to be screaming to the high heavens that you can't do this, because this is the only way we're getting service is through these vessel sharing agreements.
Yeah, and globally it's often called a block exemption, right? So here we have an antitrust enforcement immunity, but globally we've seen block exemptions, and we've seen some of the other major players review block exemptions as a general statement. Hong Kong, maybe 10 years ago, went through a whole review. Could Hong Kong removing this exemption for kind of otherwise allowed monopoly bring down the alliances? I remember was the conversation. I think the European Commission also reviews block exemptions every once in a while. Like I said, block exemptions for everybody we're getting a little technical there, is basically the same thing. It's this otherwise allowing these agreements to form with the understanding that they're being monitored. So like we know with the FMC, they file the agreements with the FMC then reviews it and then continues to monitor it. If we do away with that, then what the bill is proposing is sending it over to Department of Justice, which, I mean, they do antitrust, right? They do monopoly, the Sherman Act, all the different areas that are monopoly. They do have aviation and maritime, roughly called splash and crash, right? They have experts in these areas. So it's not to say that they don't, but it feels a little, if you're going to be reviewing mergers and acquisitions, it feels a little bit too far down the line versus reviewing the kind of monopolistic ramifications at an earlier stage. To me, it feels like an earlier stage with vessel sharing agreements and kind of, otherwise business operational agreements, instead of completely combining businesses because one is failing and one wants to buy them out.
Well, as you know, I mean, FMC has always had a memorandum of understanding with the Department of Justice for that kind of cross-pollinating and sharing of expertise. And I think one of the big concerns when OSRA 2022 is passed was, okay, this is going to firm this up even more. And the fear was that the FMC will let loose the Justice Department on this. And that's, because you go back to 2017 when they, served subpoenas at the box and they had that investigation that went on for 2 years and didn't really go anywhere. It was an investigation through the Trump administration on it and kind of fell apart there. We didn't really hear too much on it. The fear is that happens again and it goes much further this time. And I think there's a lot of concern too right now because a very contentious election is looming on the horizon. And the question is, does this get very politics? And going against foreign shipping firms is very attractive to many people until they realize how important those foreign shipping firms are for their well-being. They want to blame inflation on the high charter rates. Well, now they're dead low. I mean, they're pre-COVID, they fell lower than I thought they would ever fall. I didn't think they would fall this far down, and they bottomed out on the West Coast. And there's a lot of factors at play on the West Coast, obviously, but definitely I think that's the issue there. So I think the trust element is, I can't envision that getting through the Senate, but I just don't. I just don't think there's the wherefore for that.
I agree. And the other thing to kind of consider here too is, I mean, it makes business sense for these ocean carriers to service the U.S., but there's no requirement, right? Like if the U.S. is like, we don't want you here, if they can still make up their business with the rest of the world, we might not be getting toilet paper. Like that's a very big thing to kind of ruffle those feathers, right? I mean, that's an extreme kind of example, but really, I mean, we need the ocean carriers, and so the way to kind of help maintain harmony in this system is to monitor, and that's what we're doing. And I think giving the FMC more ability to monitor is probably the right way to go.
The original Shipping Act, 1916, we were talking about, was created because all of a sudden shipping left because of World War I. And all of a sudden we found ourselves with goods on the dock. We couldn't move anything, and caused us a recession in 1914. We had a large domestic fleet that we could sandwich in there and move around. We started a huge building program. We're in no position to do that today. There's no way we handle that. I mean, we are utterly dependent on these firms. So I think that needs to be clarified a lot more.
That's right. And that's something that you've talked about quite a bit on your show is our U.S. flag fleet, and really the kind of the depletion of the U.S. flag fleet, and the inability to meet the demands of what we would need, even with our shipbuilding. So plug, we should have more shipbuilding focus. You know, if we're going to get involved in this ocean shipping, I mean, like that's the kind of near shoring it is, you know, it used to be, and it probably still kind of is, if you control the oceans, you control the world. And so, right. You know, it's important to be able to, we would still fly in our troops, right? So U.S. flag fleet still has that kind of element of the military readiness. We would still fly in our troops, but in order to get like their entire camp and everything that they need, that would probably be coming behind them on these ships. And to have these U.S. flag ships that are able to kind of ready reserve fleet, so the terminologies, right? So basically they would turn some of these otherwise U.S. flag commercial vessels into military ready vessels. And so that's something that you've talked quite a bit about on your show before.
Right.
So let's dive over into OSRA 2.0, because we're already running out of time here too. And we only had 20 minutes the other day. We're already at 40 minutes here. But yeah, so OSRA 2.0. So I was so interested to see that the deniability, like I said, got removed from this bill. There it is.
Got my copy. Fresh up the printer as soon as it came
there
out.
It is. Yeah, right. It was released late Tuesday night after that hearing. But yeah, so it's no longer really technical corrections. It is more of an implementation act. There's kind of, like you said, some House bill items that had gotten knocked off OSRA original, even though we know the original was 1998, but OSRA 2022. So some really interesting things that I'm interested to see what you picked out, but I really liked the data standards rulemaking proposal. I like the National Seaport Advisory Committee. They talked about service contracts, complaint against shipping exchanges. I'd love to hear your kind of overall general impressions of OSRA 2.0.
I think, again, I go back to the issue of the data. I think the data is the really most important element here, because everything is so proprietary in the commercial side, and it's been so hard to get a clear-cut picture of what's happening at times. I think that was the big issue that everybody talked about. Crisis was issue is so very important. Everyone is a one. Again, we don't really have that. You know, MARAD's been the Maritime Administration has been awarding grants, and the grants are largely based on, you know, how good your proposal is. What do you want with it? You know, I don't. There's really been, okay, you got a good proposal, we'll give you money. And I think what the Port Advisory would talk about is a strategy. What's our strategy regarding ports in the United States? Should we go with a four-corner strategy? Should LA, Long Beach, Houston, Savannah, and New York be the linchpins? Should we advocate and really be dumping money into medium and small ports? Should we be doing short sea shipping? You know, what's the big overall strategy? I think OSRA is one of the things I think that this bill does. And reading the bill, it really struck me is that, okay, this is not even, you know, this is not the end of it. There's going to be more coming on. It's like, okay, this is where they want to go with this, and then what's next? And I can see coastal and inland shipping and, you know, all maritime shipping really being next. Like you said, I think they're fixing a lot of things that got booted out of the original bill by the Senate. But I think, again, to me, it's the more power and enforcement going into FMC to, well, like you said, not more enforcement, but more capabilities, more resources, I think is the big issue, and really raising that level. You know, for me, the whole reason I started my channel 2 years ago was to raise the attention of what global shipping is, because I think it gets buried underneath there. I always argue that the Department of Agriculture is the best shipping site in the U.S. government in some ways, because ag is so important for them, and therefore they track it. But I think what OSRA is doing right here, the new version, is really aiming to fix those errors, and most importantly of all is give the FMC the oversight and capabilities they've been lacking for so long.
Well, and I think that was an interesting point about the data standards, right? And so I like that we're moving more toward data standard in kind of our sites, instead of so much data portals or national data, kind of like depositories of the data. Really, the standards, right, is going to be more of the let's all speak the same language. Let's figure out what that language is. Let's figure out what these standards will be across the board. And so Mario Cordero, the executive director of Long Beach, the other day on one of the hearings was basically saying that we need integration in all of these other various formats. And so, the one thing that I felt like he was trying to kind of say was that these digital standards is going to be kind of maybe solving that problem. It's so interesting too that this is coming out because the Maritime Transportation Data Initiative out of FMC Commissioner Carl Bensel's office. As an industry, we've been waiting on this language of is it a recommendation? What the report of the recommendation comes out of that is. He's at TPM. He talked a lot about. He's really kind of supportive of these digital data standards. He mentioned DCSA, the Digital Container Shipping Association, as kind of an open source standard that's out there. We also saw earlier last month, I believe it was, the members of DCSA were saying that the ocean carriers were saying we'd like to adopt electronic bill of ladings. And so I think that we're seeing, especially if you get the carriers on board with that, we're going to be seeing digitization and these standards really kind of moving forward. And it was so interesting to see that find its way into a legislative bill and to put the rulemaking over at the FMC, which, like we said, kind of lines up with this MTDI or what we're expecting to come out of the MTDI, right?
Well, and as you said, I mean, the issue with the ports is they're fiefdoms. I mean, the way Beth Rooney runs New York, New Jersey is different than the way Bill Doyle does Baltimore, the way Gene Soroka runs LA. And you got to have this. I mean, this is the big issue when containers were introduced. There was no standard. So you had 20 foot, 35. You had weird. I mean, just nothing worked together. And you needed to make it, and what we did in global shipping was standardize containers, standardize so many features, but we haven't done it with the data. And that's really been the key thing. And, you've got to go into customs and border, and it's so hard to pull everything. And I think the other element here that was not really broached in the hearing, but I think it'll be really interesting to hear, is how this data collection and this automation is going to deal with the West Coast, particularly in the midst of this labor negotiation. So I think they were very careful at what they were saying at some points, because I think when you start talking about the electronic bills of lading, that's going to speed things up. And that's what one of the big aspects they've been talking about in this labor negotiation, which isn't just LA and Long Beach, it's every port on the West Coast that's involved in this. So you're talking about 28 ports and several thousand workers. And so I think this is an important element in going forward, because again, you talk to people across the industry, across the world, man, US ports are so behind. It's just, and it's not just the technology of cranes and automated, gee whiz trucks running around. It's I got to show up literally with paperwork in my hand and have somebody scan it in or fax it. It's crazy.
Heaven forbid you lose your piece of paper, right? That when you ingate,
right,
you lose the piece of paper somewhere along the way. And so when you outgate, you don't have that piece of paper. That's something that I feel like people don't really understand is at the ports, they really still do work in paper. I mean, sometimes they work in QR codes. Sometimes they work in a little bit more of a digital computer. I'd even say computer-based fashion. But still, I mean, I sometimes joke if a DOS system, remember from the 90s, if a DOS system is still out there, I bet it's at a port, right? I bet it would still be at some port somewhere. But I mean, so that's it, right? And I think that there's a little bit of confusion with, like you're kind of explaining, automation and robots replacing people is so different than digitization, right? We've all accepted email as a faster method than snail mail, but that doesn't mean snail mail's gone. And it's a different thing. I mean, there's no necessarily robots replacing people in that moment either, but it is just kind of a more efficient way, and I would think a more enjoyable thing. If you're kind of if you're just kind of QAing container numbers instead of typing in these otherwise seemingly random letters and numbers, and they're 16 character strings sometimes, that's very tedious, and there's a lot of potential human error in that. I'm interested to see it go either way, but we do need to stay competitive as an overall industry for the U.S. being a global shipping community, right? I mean, we need to, infrastructure is always going to be a good thing into our ports. And I think, moving toward computer-based, not necessarily automation, right? I think they are mutually exclusive, but I think that computer basing some of these things that people don't understand are paper-based is important, and QR codes, right? I mean, like everybody's got a cell phone in their hand that you download an app and maybe it gets faster that way. So,
well, there was an analogy Gene Soroka used, and I've been hard on Gene over the years, and it's many issues. But the analogy he used was we have 8 lanes of traffic coming into a 4-lane choke point, and my issue with that is with the data is, okay, you're coming into a 4-lane toll booth, and if you have people collecting money, it's going to slow you down. If an easy pass, you zip right through. And what we need to do is easy pass this, because again, I think we forget sometimes that we're not just talking about ships. We're talking about the connection from the ships to port to the road to rail to air. That's got to be the seamless transaction. We have to be able to move things so that you can quickly move them along the system. And we fixate on the ships here a little bit, but I think that's the thing that has really been the most aware to me. The one thing I was really surprised was I was hoping to see in this bill, and I'm still kind of behind the scenes trying to get this pushed in, is for another report akin to what they did in 2015 about, okay, we just had this huge event take place. What's the lessons we learned from this, and what should we be implementing in? Because I think the FMC is in the best place at all to do another kind of, okay, what did we learn? Did we learn anything from 2015? And what do we really need to be doing looking forward? And here are those recommendations, because I think Congress is listening to that right now.
Yeah, maybe another fact finding for Commissioner Dye. She does them so well. Her reports are very thorough. That could be another congressionally directed from Sal directly.
I told you they need a historian. They need a historian there. I keep telling you.
Yeah, maybe you could join her team. She's very into teams. It's she had the supply chain innovation team before she created the fact findings or was assigned to the fact findings. So I think that's a great idea, and maybe even a comparison of the 2015 study, which largely I feel like flies below the radar, unfortunately. But so does so much of the FMC's great work through the years. I think that's a great idea of having a kind of post-action report, one that we're still waiting on the Suez Canal Authority, right? We're still waiting on that post-action report from the Ever Given.
2 years waiting for Panama to come out with that report. Although there is now a memorial at the site, the Suez Canal Authority. I posted that today on Twitter. There was actually a buddy of mine went through, so that you can commemorate the site right there, where only the Egyptians would commemorate that disaster.
I saw that. But no, I like that idea. I mean, obviously the FMC is very busy right now, but maybe we add some employees over there. We get the economists and the lawyers working together, and we do a 2015 versus now, what was predicted and what happened over the last few years, because it was an anomaly. We keep saying that it was an anomaly. This was strange, but it was also kind of this hyper-focused version of what we kind of were anticipating, or what the FMC was kind of anticipating in 2015. So,
yeah, I mean, it is. I always associate it akin to the world wars. I mean, you haven't had a global disruption of shipping on that scale since then, and that's what it. And post World Wars, we were much different shipping than we were pre-World War, and then we're in that same position now.
Well, so before we end here, and I really appreciate your time today, is there anything else that you kind of think that that Congress generally, I mean, if you could speak directly to Congress, right, and you do through your channel, I'm sure you have quite a few congressmen listening in on what's going on with shipping. But is there anything else that, obviously this report, anything else that you think that they're still kind of missing in their trying to seize the moment of reforming ocean shipping?
Yeah, I think, I think they're obviously playing catch up. So they're being reactive, not proactive. And one of the things I really think that needs to be done is really a national maritime strategy. We talked about national ports a little while ago, but I think a true national maritime strategy. What do we want? How do we want our shipping to be handled? We're so dependent. We are interlocked. The Mark Levinson, the globalization, we are there. We cannot exist by throwing the walls up and just putting our head in the sand. We are forever locked in the system that we're in now. But what does that kind of strategy need to look like? Where do we want to go? Do we want to have the 4 big ports? That's just a short little version of that. But there's a lot of other things too. How does the highways and the railway systems, Class 1 railways, look what happened with Class 1 railways. If all of a sudden there's a strike, man, that's going to back up every ship coming in. So how does that relate in there, because I think the infrastructure element and the transportation element with commerce and labor, it has so many factors. It really goes across government departmental lines. It deals with carriers and consumers. I mean, I want to see chambers of commerce in big towns and little towns involved, because they're involved in this. And most importantly, there is visibility now. I don't get visibility. No one watches my show just to watch me. Believe me, this is not something you want to watch. They watch it because they're interested in shipping right now. And so, there's a medium for that. There's an appetite for that. So I think Congress has to kind of embrace that. And whether it's the Federal Maritime Commission, the Maritime Administration, or an independent group, or it's the state and federal maritime academies, whoever wants to put that together and start looking at that issue, I think that's the one that's out there. Because like you said, we are so dependent on it. There's so many people who take for granted putting their goods, I'm going to push that button on Amazon and it'll be here in 2 days, but that's a 180-day process that, that algorithm knew you were going to hit that button and order that. And when there's a disruption in the Suez Canal, when there's a typhoon, when there's a hurricane, when there's, a port strike or something else that we can't imagine, which will happen because everything we've possibly imagined has happened so far, it will cause a disruption. And you can't plan for everything, but you really need to have a good overview of how you're going to handle contingencies, which is I think is kind of lacking right now. We're just being extremely proactive.
Yeah, great point. I think you're exactly right. We're kind of reeling from the last 2 years. They were an anomaly, but what are we going to do going forward to make sure that we're better prepared and better protected as a general nation, so that we don't have run on toilet paper, right? So that we don't have shortages of whatever it is where the shortage of the day is. So and resultantly, it created, I think, at least in part, some of this inflation, because if it costs more to move the good, it's going to cost more for you to purchase that good at the end.
It is. And we need to be able to do things differently than we've done. We need to be able to invest in shipping. There needs to be ideas. If you look how Europeans and Asians are really looking at these elements, we do it much differently here. And so, I think we've seen a lot of people make money recently off shipping, because they've been playing markets and looking at things. But I think now, this has got so much visibility. Again, I go back to what you talked about. If you can get Dusty Johnson proposing this, that means there are people across America who all of a sudden are seeing this and how important this is.
Yeah, that's right. Well, thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate your extra time here. We went quite long, but I think this was a really great conversation. Get two maritime professors in a room together, we could go for hours, right? So really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Sal, for coming on. And everybody who's listening to me, go check out what's going on with shipping with Sal Mercogliano. He puts out at least one, maybe two a week. Is that the frequency?
At least, usually about 2 or 3 a week. So it depends on what's happening. It depends on what's happening. It just depends.
There's so
on what
much going on.
Just depends right now. Right now, there's a dam barge I'm dealing with. So that's the one. It's a barge against a dam. So that's what we're dealing with on the Ohio River.
I love it. All right. Well, thanks again, Sal. So great to have you on. Really appreciate being here today.
Thanks, Lauren. I appreciate it.
So as always, I hope you enjoyed the conversation today. We really appreciate having Dr. Sal Mercogliano today. This was a great conversation, and all thanks to you guys, the listeners who said you wanted to have guests on the show. As always, though, the guidance here is general and for educational purposes only. It should not be construed to be legal advice directly related to your matter. If you need an attorney, contact an attorney. But if you have specific legal questions, feel free to reach out to me at my legal company, Squall Strategies. Otherwise, for the non-legal questions, the e-learning, the general industry information and insights, come find me at the Maritime Professor. If you like these videos, specifically if you like today's conversation with a guest, let me know. Comment, like, and share. If you want to listen to these episodes on demand, or if you missed any previous episodes, check out the podcast By Land and by Sea. If you prefer to see the video, they live on my YouTube page, By Land and by Sea, presented by the Maritime Professor. And while you're at it, check out the website, maritimeprofessor.com. So until next week, this is Lauren Beagen, the Maritime Professor, and you've just listened to By Land and by Sea. See you next time.